see everyone this morning. Good to be here again with you. And I do have a lot of ground to cover, and this is probably, I don't know if there is a favorite topic, but this is probably the most talked about issue in Islam, the seemingly or supposed radical Islam that exists out there. So I think people are very excited. I think a lot of people kind of mark this one on the calendar as far as wanting to hear maybe my perspective on what that is and how it came about and just how I feel about it and so on and so forth. So I'll do the best that I can to just give you my perspective, and I want to encourage you to remember that what you're going to hear is just my perspective. So I'm certainly not gospel myself. I wouldn't take any of it and say, well, this one time this kid told me that this, and this, so that means that everybody this, and this. There's lots of different thoughts about lots of different things out there, but I'm more than happy to share with you how I feel about various things, and through my studies, through my upbringing, and through my experiences personally dealing with other people. So the reason for this study can probably be summed up by something another Christian, someone that I knew loosely attended another church in a different location, said on Facebook many years ago, but it was probably 5-6 years ago now. This person made a Facebook post and it said, quote, "I learned all I needed to know about Islam on 9/11/2001. Another Christian made another Facebook post at some point that read, quote, "Not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslim." It's very difficult to read those because that combination of ignorance and prejudice and indifference is frankly unbecoming of what we ought to be as Christians and what we certainly are described as or called to be. We are called to make disciples of all nations, so that, of course that would include Muslim nations, and the only way that we can do this is if we are understanding who we are trying to reach. On one hand, we might ask ourselves, why even study this topic of Islam? And of course we understand the Great Commission, what we're called to do, but there are other reasons also why we should study Islam. As far as I'm concerned, the Great Commission is kind of I wouldn't need anything else. The authority of the Bible would be good enough for me. But if you want to know some practical reasons why you should be interested in Islam, I can give you several. It's the second largest religion in the world after, quote, Christianity. Of course, we understand that those numbers are skewed, but nonetheless, the second largest religion in the world, and will soon be the second largest religion in America. A couple of statistics for you as the world is concerned. The world's Muslim population is expected to increase by 35% in the next 15 years, rising from 1.6 billion to 2.2 billion Muslims in the world by the year of 2030. So 2030, years ago, when we were all younger, sounded like, not even gonna, make it there. Well, 2030 is coming pretty close now, as weird as that is to say. 2.2 billion Muslims in the world at that time. Muslims represent the majority population in 56 countries. 56 countries. Muslims represent the majority population. That includes, you may not know, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Egypt, of course, Iraq, and Nigeria. In addition, you will actually find significant Muslim populations in these countries as well. India, China, most of the Central Asian republics, and Russia, as well as, of course, Europe and America. They are literally everywhere. You can find Muslims just about anywhere you go. And not just a few, but large Muslim populations. Contrary to popular belief or assumption, the majority of Muslims are not Arabic. Most people kind of think that all Muslims are Arabic. Only 20% originate from Arab countries. The largest Muslim communities are found in Asia, Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. Now what about America? That's over there, and unless you plan on making a trip, then maybe you won't run into some of those things. What about America? Population projections show the number of Muslims more than doubling over the next 2 decades, more than doubling. More than doubling. Rising from 2.6 million in 2010 to 6.2 million Muslims in the United States in 2030. The Muslim share of the U.S. population is projected to grow from 0.8% in 2010 to 1.7% in 2030, making Muslims roughly as numerous as you might find some people in the denominational world. They'll be that common coming pretty soon, and they are in many places. In Tennessee, I know that they are. There are some really big mosques in Tennessee, and some that were vandalized and terrorized in recent years, as you may know. Muslims are and will increasingly be our neighbors, our colleagues, fellow citizens, people that we see at Publix, or I guess up here, Kroger and Food Line. Yet most Americans, despite these facts that say that all these people are going to be here, most Americans admit to knowing little, if anything, about Islam. In 2010, in January, Gallup research says 43% of Americans admit to feeling at least a little prejudice toward Muslims. 43% of people admit to feeling a little prejudice toward Muslims. That's almost, imagine dividing the building in half, just a little bit less than that, and 43% feeling prejudice toward this group of people that they don't know. Pew Research suggested in August 2010, 55% of Americans said they know little or nothing about Islam. More than half the population in the United States, or the average between these two studies of the population in the United States, admits to feeling biased and says we don't know anything about it, or barely anything about it. So those are several reasons why I think we need to study this topic. Anytime you're not educated in something, it might be a good idea to learn. It's a good thing, especially when we're called to make disciples of all nations and we don't know these people. So what should our approach be this morning? In our society, there are obviously two extremes, pluralism and prejudice. Pluralism, some people would suggest to you that all religions are good. They're all basically the same, they're all good. And then there's prejudice. Some people might say all Muslims are bad, all Muslims are evil, there is no good Muslim. So we can see examples, of course, of Jesus and the apostles dealing with others from various religious backgrounds, which I think is quite powerful. And I'll just give you a couple examples before we move on this morning. But in John chapter 4, starting in verse 7, we have this woman of Samaria that Jesus meets at the well. And in verse 7 in John chapter 4, a woman from Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." So what we find here is actually very interesting, because what we have is two groups of people from two societies that have no dealings with each other, which might be very similar to what we just described in terms of Christians have no dealings with Muslims. I don't know how many of us have dealings with Muslims. But here is the author and perfecter of our faith with this person that he's supposed to have no dealings with from this society. And not only does he deal with her, as we all know the story, but he actually doesn't just have a casual conversation, doesn't just exchange, goods or money or whatever. He gives her the most important message that she will ever hear in her life. Not only did Jesus just deal with this woman, he spoke truth. He showed kindness to this woman and spoke truth to this woman. That should be our approach today. And of course, as Paul addresses the Areopagus in Acts chapter 17, as he says, "I see that you worship an unknown God, and what is to you unknown, what you know or what you worship in ignorance, I will make known to you." Paul immediately establishes with these Greeks some common ground about, hey, I know that on your altar it says to an unknown God, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to use that common ground, basically. I'm going to tell you about this unknown God. You're going to be amazed at who this is. So even Paul established common ground and then spoke truth. There's always kindness or common ground established, and then there's always speaking the truth. Our guiding principle and how we go about this should be the golden rule. We would want to treat Muslims, or we should treat Muslims the way that we wish to be treated. The actions of a Christian, if they are wrong, should not be held representative of our faith. It really bugs me. One of the most frustrating things as an evangelist and as I would be having Bible studies is when people would say, I don't go to the Church of Christ, because one time I went there and they were so mean to me, they were so rude, they weren't hospitable, they were so cold, they were so this, they were so that, and I'm thinking, what does it have to do with me? And more importantly, what does it have to do with God's Word? But people take these things and they, again, like we said yesterday, they take that broad brush and just go ahead and paint every single person in this building the same way. It's silly. We get upset when people do that, but oftentimes we end up doing the same thing with another population. Muslims can and do oftentimes have prejudiced and uninformed views of Christians, especially Americans. I want you to think about our society from the Eastern point of view. The music that's constantly produced in our society that is so popular around the world that 95% of it we should not be listening to. The movies and the TV shows that are produced on this side of the world, that 95% of it, it's a little extreme, let's say 90%, take whatever percent you want. There's a bunch of it that's bad. So how do you think these Muslims are viewing Western culture? We're pagans to them. Can't believe that you would be in a society that promotes football. You would miss a service to watch a football game? Who are these people over there? And they say that we're bad people? You can imagine. They'd probably be pretty upset. Now, of course, that's an uninformed view, right? Because here we are. I don't think there's any football on today, but there's the Masters. And here we are, right? But they might paint with that broad brush and say, yeah, you're probably one of them that would miss, a church service to watch Arsenal. I've not missed a church service to watch Arsenal. And I love me some Arsenal. I went over to England to watch them play. You probably don't know who that is. Okay, I'll talk about it later. Let's not do the same. Instead, let's us consult original sources as much as possible. We don't want to hear what Johnny said to whoever, or what Ahmed said to Muhammad, or what. Let's consult original sources. So this morning we're going to look at the Quran and see what it says. We're going to discriminate and choose and understand and decide what the original text was saying versus what the text is saying today. In other words, the context. We're going to recognize that actions of some don't identify the group. And we are going to practice intellectual honesty and understanding. We're going to be honest about what we read today. So the three things that I want to talk to you about today, probably the most popular, jihad. Everybody seems to know what that is, or seemingly so. Warfare and terrorism. Probably the one Islamic term more Americans know than any other term is jihad. I don't think anybody knows any Arabic words, but they know that one. They don't know what it means, but they know that one. This word and its implications for Islam are often misunderstood. To many Americans, jihad means holy war, which is actually al-harb. Al-harb is holy war. That is the motto of Islamic terrorism. In this lesson, we'll examine what the Quran actually says about jihad, warfare, and terrorism. Jihad comes from the root word jihada, and jihad means to put forth a great effort, or to strive, to put forth a great effort in striving for something. That's what jihad means. The word jihad actually occurs only a few times in the context, in the proper context in the Quran that we would understand. And I'll read a few of those for you. In Surah 9, verse 24, Surah just means chapter. So I could just say chapter 9. But Surah 9, verse 24 in the Quran reads, if your fathers, your sons, your brothers, your wives, your kindred, the wealth that you have gained, and the commerce in which you fear a decline, and the dwellings in which you delight are dearer to you than God and his messenger, and striving hard in his cause, then wait until God brings about his decision, and God guides not the people who are rebellious. So did you catch where jihad was in this and the context of that? So this list is given: your fathers, your sons, your brothers, your wives, your kindred, your wealth that you have gained, and the commerce in which you fear a decline, and the dwellings in which you delight. It reads, if all of those things are more important to you than God and his prophet, that's speaking about Muhammad, and jihad, striving hard in his cause, then wait until God brings about his judgment. And God does not support or guide the rebellious people. So what this is actually saying is, if you count your wealth and your boats and your hunting rifles and your soccer gear and all this stuff, if you count any of those things more important than striving hard in the cause for God, then God's not going to be happy. Well, I would say the same thing as a Christian. If you were to count anything materially and place that above Jesus and striving hard to be the most dedicated, diligent Christian that you can be, that would be a problem. That would be a problem. In chapter 22, or Surah 22, in verses 77 and 78, O you who have believed, bow down and prostrate yourselves and worship your Lord, and do good that you may be successful, and strive hard in God's cause as you ought to strive. He has chosen you to convey his message to mankind, inviting them to Islam. He hasn't laid upon you any hardship in religion. It is the religion of your father Abraham. It is God who has named you Muslims, both before and in the Quran, that the messenger Muhammad may be a witness over you, and you to be witness over mankind. So perform prayer, give alms, and hold fast to God. He is your Lord. What an excellent Lord. So here we have the context of jihad, to strive hard in his cause, is specifically speaking to inviting people to evangelism, for Muslims to invite other people to Islam. Not to go and murder anybody or anything like that. I'll read again quickly. O you who have believed, bow down and prostrate yourselves and worship your Lord, and do good that you may be successful. And strive hard in God's cause as you ought to strive. And jihad. Go perform jihad. What is that? Right there in the context. Just keep reading. This is oftentimes where people take the Bible and they'll read, a part of the verse. It's kind of like the 500 being killed at the brook of Kishon, and they're going, well, there's war, all over your Bible. And we go, well, that's the Old Testament. They go, well, don't you believe in the Old Testament? We say, yes. But they don't understand the context. So we need to understand the context. The very next part of the verse, it's not even a different verse, the very next sentence in this verse reads, he has chosen you to convey his message to mankind, inviting them to Islam. So jihad in this context literally means to strive hard in evangelizing, which frankly, as a Christian, I try and get people to do every day, to strive hard in the cause of Christ, to evangelize. In chapter 25 and verse 52, so obey not the disbelievers, but strive against them by preaching with the utmost endeavor with the Quran. Here's one that's interesting, because it says to not obey the disbelievers. And we would expect that the next part of the verse would be, do not obey them, behead them. But instead of that, it says strive against them by preaching with the utmost endeavor with the Quran, which is the exact same thing I'm doing for Christ today. And I have done many times, to battle and strive hard against anybody who doesn't believe, to try and help them see the truth that is the Lord, Jesus Christ. So as you can see in these instances, none of them are explicitly about violence. For most Muslims, jihad refers to the spiritual struggle that it is to live according to the teachings of God. Now, I think we probably can relate to that, because as you might have noticed in your walk as a Christian, it is difficult. It is not always easy. We have to strive hard. We have to work hard at being a Christian. And again, like I said yesterday, I'm not talking about showing up. I'm talking about actually being a diligent follower of Christ. I'm talking about leaving everything behind and taking up your cross and carrying it daily. What about warfare? So that's jihad. What about warfare? There's a lot of references to literal warfare and combat in the Quran and in Islamic tradition. But is it true that terrorists like Osama bin Laden and others are simply just obeying Quranic commands? They're just looking at the Quran and saying, well, this is what it said to do. It said to kill you, so I got to kill you. That's the question. According to some critics, people would say yes. That is what is happening. If you think that, you have to read the text and understand the context. And we'll do some of that. We'll do some of that. Probably the most widely quoted surah that people use to pinpoint the Quran as this murderous religion is Surah 9, verse 5. And I'll read to you a quote that I found on the internet. When you look up this verse, a lot of times this is what you find. Surah 9, verse 5. It says, when the 4 forbidden months are over, wherever you encounter the idolaters, kill them, seize them, besiege them, and wait for them at every lookout post. I read something else on the internet that has another variation of Surah 9, chapter 5. Fight and slay the pagans, fight and slay the Christians, wherever you find them, and seize them, confine them, and lie in wait for them in every place of ambush. Now, I've got a few issues with this that I'll explain to you. First, many of these critics of Islam fail to quote the entire verse. So what I just read to you is not the entire verse. But this is oftentimes when you look up sword verses, or someone probably asked me about sword verses Monday night. When you look up warfare or terrorism or jihad, Surah 9:5 is kind of one of the poster boys for what they want to say, what people want to say, and it's oftentimes not quoted in its entirety. Which I'm not saying it's a great verse. I'm not saying anything about the Quran is great. What I'm telling you is that we need to be honest. We need to practice intellectual honesty. Let's look at the entire verse. When the 4 forbidden months are over, wherever you encounter the idolaters, kill them, seize them, besiege them, and wait for them at every lookout post. But if they turn to God, maintain prayer, and pay the prescribed alms, let them go on their way, for God is most forgiving and merciful. That's the rest of the verse. So there's a little bit of a difference there between, you can go and kill these idolaters however you want, and hey, if these people, come to an understanding of God, you need to let them go on their way. I'll read verse 6 because it's all in the same context. If any one of the idolaters should seek your protection, grant it to them that they may hear the word of God. Then take them to a safe place, for they are people without knowledge of it. So not only should they, if they turn to God, be allowed to go on their way, if they actually want protection, these idolaters want protection, you actually have to grant them protection according to the Quran, so that they can study the word of God to them, which would have been the Quran. You also might notice that there are modern translations that say slay the Christians. There is no original translation that says slay the Christians. It says slay the idolaters. If you know anything about that time, which you should because you're well versed in the Old Testament, idolatry was kind of a big deal back in the day. I would say idolatry is still a really big deal. Today it's just a sports car instead of a piece of wood or something. So these people were fighting idolaters. Happened in the Old Testament all the time. Interestingly, and this is, I think, what really kills Muslims and what really hurts them, Osama bin Laden does the exact same thing that most often we find on the internet. He cuts off the part of the verse that says, hey, if these people come to God, we got to take care of them. He doesn't want you to know that. Why? Because he's a terrorist. And it doesn't support his agenda. So he would only use the parts that would say fight when the forbidden months are past, Fight and slay the pagans wherever you find them, and seize them and beleaguer them and lie in wait for them at every lookout post. That is exactly what Osama bin Laden said in his attack against the United States. These sorts of selective quotations obviously do not do full justice to what the Quran actually says. And in reality, unless you're reading an Arabic Quran, they're very easy to understand. You can get an English one, and you can read it just like anything else and understand it. It's not that difficult to understand for yourself. There are several categories of statements in the Quran that we'll talk about. There are some passages that encourage tolerance and peace. In chapter 2, verse 256, there shall be no compulsion in the acceptance of religion. The right course has become clear from the wrong, so whoever disbelieves in evil and believes in God has grasped the most trustworthy handhold with no break in it. So this verse actually says that there is no compulsion in religion, which, if you understand that correctly, means that they literally are told in Islam that they cannot force you to obey their religion. It is against the Quran to force you, for a Muslim to hold a gun to your head and say, you have to obey this religion. So just because people do it, well, hey, there's lots of stuff that's said in the Bible, and people do the opposite, and they walk around and say they're Christians. It happens every day. There's Muslims that look at the Quran and say, well, I'm just not going to do that part, which of course is wrong, and I think doesn't make them Muslim. But the Quran teaches, just to be clear, the Quran teaches that there is no compulsion in religion. You cannot force anybody to accept Islam. In chapter 60, verse 8, God does not forbid you to deal kindly and justly with those who have fought against you about the religion and expelled you from your homes. God does not love the unjust people. Here it says God does not forbid you to deal kindly and justly with those who have fought against you. So there is nothing forbidden in Islam about Muslims dealing kindly with people, even if they fought against them. It specifically says that you can deal kindly with these people. There are passages that permit defensive warfare. We're going to try and cover the whole gamut to get the full context and the full story. So these permit defensive warfare only. Chapter 2, verse 190. Fight in the way of God against those who fight against you, but begin not hostilities. Lo, God does not love the aggressors. So this one says you can fight in the way of God against those who fight against you, but you cannot begin hostilities. In other words, you cannot assert your own, hostile actions. And the verse wraps up by saying God does not love aggressive people or the aggressors. In chapter 9, verse 36, the number of months in the sight of God is 12 in a year, so ordained by him the day he created the heavens and the earth, and them four are sacred. That is the straight usage. So wrong not yourselves therein, and fight the pagans altogether as they fight you altogether. But know that God is with those who restrain themselves. So the latter part of this verse says, so wrong not yourselves therein. You can fight the pagans altogether as they fight you altogether. So again, it's permitting a defensive warfare. As you push me, I can push back, is what the religion is saying. But then it wraps up by saying God is not with those, or God is with those who restrain themselves. So it is encouraged that they restrain themselves. There are passages also that speak of unconditional, unlimited war against non-Muslims. In chapter 8, verse 39, fight them on until there is no more tumult or oppression, and there prevail justice and faith in God altogether and everywhere. But if they cease, verily God does see all. So this one doesn't have really a condition necessarily to start hostilities. It just says fight until there is no more. There's no more oppression. So you could, if you understand the context, imply maybe that they were oppressed, but it doesn't necessarily say that, so I won't go as far to say that. In chapter 9, verse 73, O prophet, fight against the disbelievers and the hypocrites and be harsh upon them, and their refuge is hell, and wretched is the destination. So this one says fight against the disbelievers and the hypocrites and to be harsh upon them. This is an unlimited, mostly, seemingly, very unlimited and unrestricted Quranic verse that says you can fight against people who disbelieve. So how do we make application to something like that today? Because I think that last verse is probably one of the ones where we're going, well, wait a second. Why is it okay that they can fight against people who disbelieve? Isn't that exactly the problem that we're experiencing today? Well, yeah, I think the crucial issue anytime you're dealing with a text of antiquity, which of these passages applies today? How are we supposed to understand this passage today? I have these conversations with people all the time when they go, well, God's a murderer, and he might do it again. He drowned everybody in Noah's time. You try and talk with people, and you try and get them to understand the difference and the different times, the different groups that were spoken to. I mean, there's lots of, it can be very complex when we're not studying. Some Muslims of old have argued that these passages that speak of tolerance are useless today. Some Muslims would argue that there is no tolerance, that the prevailing view of the Quran for today is war. That is what they call the classical doctrine. This school of thought, however, is a very minority view, because Muslim scholars, the people that actually study the Quran and study these things for a living, they say, well, that violates exactly what was said by Muhammad in chapter 2 and verse 26 when he said there's no compulsion in religion. How is it that we can fight people who disbelieve when our own book says you cannot force people to obey? I mean, it's a pretty easy, it's actually not that hard to defend against the people that want to use the Quran for violence, because the Quran is so clear on you're not supposed to use violence in religion. It's so, it's written in plain Arabic. As the Muslim community grew, questions quickly emerged as to what proper behavior was during times of war. And the Quran provided detailed guidelines for regulations regarding the conduct of war. And before I share those with you, you have to understand the context. So they obviously go down to Saudi Arabia. And Muhammad, I don't know if you know the story. It doesn't need to be an exhaustive deal. But this was a pagan land. This was people worshiping idols at that time. Muhammad starts getting revelation from the angel Gabriel. Obviously don't believe this, but this is the story. He starts getting revelation from the angel Gabriel in mountains. In a mountain. He used to go away to a cave to get away from the idolaters. He comes back and tells some of his family eventually, hey, there is a God. There is only one true God. This idol worshiping is not right. Muhammad's followers grow. They believe in the one true God. The idolaters who have built this land, this commerce, these villages, they try and kill Muhammad. Why? And his followers. Because they believe in God. Well, this is a pretty common, thing. So they fought back against the idolaters, because in fact Muhammad and his people were kicked out of their land by the idolaters. Listen, if you kick me out of my house, I can tell you right now, I'm going to grab some of my buddies and I'm going to my gun safe and I'm coming back to get my house. I think that's probably pretty reasonable to expect. You come into my house and you try and hurt my wife and kids, I'm probably going to defend myself. Probably. Be a watchdog or something. Get a corgi. So this is the context behind Islam. And all these wars and all these verses that you see, they're referring to the idolaters that kicked them out of their own land. We would say often again the same thing about the Old Testament and the disobedience, God's plan to establish his people, using the Old Testament as a tutor, as our guide. We would say the exact same thing. But let's go on and talk about these detailed guidelines and regulations regarding the conduct of war, because there was some. And in fact, some of the first regulations about war were made at this time. Who is to fight and who is exempted? In chapter 48, verse 17, there is no blame for the blind, nor is there blame for the lame, nor is there blame for the sick, that they do not go to war. So it tells us immediately there that if you're sick, you have some kind of illness, if you're lame or you're blind, you did not have to go to war at that time. There were also regulations on when hostilities must cease. Chapter 2, verse 192, and if they cease, then indeed God is often forgiving and merciful. Muhammad and his followers created some of the first rules of war in Arabia. Some of the rules were, they exempted women, children, and monks and rabbis and elderly from fighting and being killed. You could not kill a woman in battle. You could not kill a child. You could not kill a monk. You could not kill a rabbi. You could not kill the elderly. It outlawed torture. You could not capture people and torture them. Mutilation of the dead. You had to let people collect their dead and bury their dead after war. Sexual violence. You could not go around raping and pillaging. Killing of diplomats. You could not kill diplomats because those are the ones that had to be left to create peace. Unnecessary destruction of property. You could not run through a village and just burn buildings down. You could not just go and destroy religious institutions. You couldn't go burn down the temple of the idolaters. You couldn't go burn down the hospital. You couldn't go burn down the school. You couldn't do that stuff. These were all rules of war for the Muslims. So the prevailing opinion of Muslims is that passages like chapter 9, verse 5, have no modern application today. Well, what about terrorism? Only got a few more minutes. What about terrorism? Given what we've studied about the rules of war in Islam, it's obvious that terrorists like Osama bin Laden do not operate under the belief of the Quran. They operate contrary to the belief of the Quran. So what is terrorism then? Well, it's the deliberate and random use of violence against civilians for political gain. So that's what terrorism is. When someone has a political agenda and they want to execute it, this is what they do. In the most extensive polling ever done of Muslim nations, Muslims around the world, this is terrible, Muslims around the world were asked if the attacks of 9/11 were justified. 7% of Muslims around the world responded and said, yes, the attacks on 9/11 were justified. 7%, which is horrible. It should be negative 20%, that anybody would think an attack like that would be justified. I'm with you. But what that also means is that there's 93% of Muslims that said, no, those attacks were not justified. They were wrong. And they condemned them. How is it how would it be fair for us to lump the 93% that said these attacks were wrong with the 7% that said they were right? Imagine a survey of Christians, professed Christians around the world. So if you got a survey and it said in there, not just you, think about every single place in the country, in the world that is meeting and claiming Christ. This denomination, that denomination, Wesley, Smith, Calvin, every single one of them. Imagine they all got a survey and it said, are you a Christian? They would say yes. Imagine if that same survey said, do you believe that baptism is necessary for salvation? You know how that survey would come back? 7% of us would say, yeah, it is. And 93% would say, absolutely not. You can sprinkle, you can pour. You don't even need to do that. Come up here and say the sinner's prayer. You don't even need to do that. Just listen through the TV or the phone. Or just send us a check. And we'll send you the holy water. Or why not? Faith only. We know that if that survey happened, only 7% of people would actually say that baptism is necessary for salvation. Now, I wouldn't like it very much if a Muslim came over and said, well, I know that baptism is not necessary in your faith. And I would say, excuse me? So yeah, I saw a survey that said 93% of Christians believe that it's not necessary. It would really bug me if I was lumped in with that 93%. We cannot do that ourselves. So some frequently asked questions and some answers. Is there such thing as radical Islam? No, absolutely not. There is no such thing as radical Islam. You might be shocked to hear that. Let me ask you this. Is there such a thing as radical Christianity? No. Where in the scriptures, if you can point to me one verse that says, here is where the radical Christians met. Here's where the liberal Christians met. Here's where the antis met. Oh, here were the Protestants. Here were the Catholics. Here were the Episcopalians. It was great. They all built their own building on the same block of the road. If you can find that anything close to that in the scriptures, I need to know. There were no radical Christians. There were just Christians mentioned. There were no non-denominational Christians. They were just Christians. They were called Christians first at Antioch. This is who these people are. So is there anything like that in Islam? No, they're just Muslims. There's just Muslims that are mentioned in the Quran. And anything outside of that is a man-made, man-intended invention. We accept that about the church history. If we want to be honest and we want to practice intellectual honesty, we have to accept that. Other places as well. Are the terrorist groups Muslim? Another frequently asked question. No, absolutely not. That should be evident by the last 40 minutes that we just spent. Those Muslim terrorists, quote, are about as Muslim as these 6 Christian terrorist groups that you can look up on Google right now. Very well documented. The Army of God, Eastern Lighting, the Lord's Resistance Army, the National Liberation Front, the Phineas Priesthood, and the Concerned Christians. All 6 of these are Christian terrorist groups. Those folks are about as Christian as my left shoe. I wouldn't dare say that there is something as a Christian terrorist group. That's not possible. You cannot be a Christian and be a terrorist. You cannot be a Muslim and be a terrorist. It doesn't jive. It doesn't work. Well, if the terrorists aren't Muslim and they're not Christian, SAIF, then who are they? Terrorists. They're just terrorists. They're exactly who they are based on their actions. This is a good question. Why are the terrorists so popular? Why is it they're not very popular? We understand the minority, right? Terrorism. Why is it appealing to people? To understand why terrorism might even be considered, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of maybe a young person in the Middle East who may have watched their door broken down in Palestine by the army of an opposing nation, let's say. Tie them up, their entire family, rape the mom, rape their sister, kill the father. Now, this isn't a fairy tale. This happens. And if you know anything about the conflict overseas and you've done any research, because it's not posted on CNN and Fox News, you got to dig. It would be against the United States political agenda to put something like that on TV. Now, if I'm a 16-year-old, 17-year-old, 18-year-old young man, and I had watched something like that happen to my family, I'm not sure what else I would do. Going to college, getting an education, and trying to find a career, probably not high on my priority list at that point. Being extremely distraught, sad, and pushed to the point of revenge, probably. That's probably what would end up happening to 90-something% of people if that would happen. Many things overseas happen that don't get a lot of media exposure here. Terrible things. Senseless acts of violence, same thing that we would see here in other ways. I don't think terrorism obviously is very appealing itself, but you can understand in the context of that's a tough situation. Final question maybe, what could we do to help? I can tell you exactly what you can do to help. You don't need to write a check to somebody. You don't need to, do this, do that. You need to share the gospel, because the reality is, no matter how much you improve somebody's physical life here, it's irrelevant if they're not going to be with the Father for eternity. And that is the best thing you could do for any soul on this planet. Share the gospel. And I know that you will, because that's why all of you are here and interested in this study, so that you can do that. Thank you for your time. Looking forward to the next session.